I'm Tracy. I'm the owner of Layered Creations. We're an online quilting store based in Perth, Western Australia. And welcome to our class on the disappearing fall patch. This is what I'm going to show you how to make today. This is the disappearing fall patch, and it looks spectacular, it looks complicated, but it's actually quite easy to do. And we start with the basic fall patch. So we take 4 squares. I'm using 5-inch squares. Charm squares are great for making these, but I'm just using some 5-inch squares that I've cut from fabric that I've got in the shop. And we're going to lay them out. So we've got 2 each of 2 different fabrics. One's dark and one's light. And we're going to lay those out in a 4-patch arrangement. And we're going to have the same fabric on opposite corners, so diagonal to each other. Okay, and we're going to sew that into a 4-patch. And for those of you who haven't done it before, we're basically going to lay the squares on the right hand side face down and right sides together on the squares on the left hand side, and we're going to sew those together, and that'll make 2 rows. Now I like to pin my fabrics when I sew them. Some people are quite comfortable taking it to the machine and just sewing a 1/4-inch seam without pinning, and that's perfectly fine. If you feel comfortable doing that, that's perfectly fine. I just like to pin mine just to stop the fabrics from slipping as they go through the machine. And as I said, we're going to sew a 1/4-inch seam. For me, it's down the right hand side. If you're left-handed, you could do it down the left-hand side, whichever actually works for you, as long as you're joining those together. And we're going to do what's called chain piecing. So we're going to take these to the sewing machine, and I'm going to sew them one after the other without cutting the threads between the blocks as I'm sewing. The squares as I'm sewing. I'm just holding my threads, my tails out of the way. Now, because we're sewing quilt blocks, we don't need to reverse stitch to secure the thread at the beginning and the end of our stitching. And the reason for that is because when you join them to other blocks, you're sewing across the end of that seam anyway and securing it. Remembering not to sew over the top of your pins. I've seen the pins break when that's happened and flick up, and that can obviously be a bit of a hazard if you get a bit in your eye. And the other thing to remember is it's not a race. You don't have to race through this and do it as fast as you can. And in fact, I find when I go too fast, my stitches tend to be tighter and closer together, so the tension is off, and that can cause the fabric sometimes to pucker. So we're going to use our trusty thread snips here to cut our threads. Pull those out, ready for the next one. And so you can see those squares have been sewn together, but they're still connected by the thread between them because I was chain piecing them. So we're just going to snip that, and then we're going to press these to the dark side. So what that means is we're going to fold this open, okay, and we're going to press those apart so that we get a nice flat seam, and we're going to press upwards towards the dark fabric. So pressing up towards the dark fabric so that the seam then sits up towards the dark fabric. That way you don't get dark fabrics showing through on your light coloured fabric inside your quilt. So we always press to the dark side, thinking in Star Wars terms. But before we do that, we actually just press the top of that seam. And when I say press, I mean press, not iron. We're not ironing, we're actually just pressing. And that sets the seam. And then we'll press that open. and pressing towards the dark side. And then we do the same thing with our other one. Set the seam, and we're pressing, if I can get it open, towards the dark side. Okay, so I need to snip my threads from my other end of my sewing so that they're not getting tangled and in my way, and we're going to put these back the way that they were. Oops. So we've now got our 2 rows, and we're going to again take the top, lay it over the bottom row, right sides together, and we're going to nest our seams. So because the dark fabrics are on opposite sides to each other, and we've pressed the seams towards the dark side, it means that the seams are pressed away from each other. So there's a little ridge down the edge of that seam that you use to rest up or butt up or nest up against the other seam, and it helps to make a nice point in the middle of your 4 patch so that all 4 fabrics, all 4 squares come together in exactly the right spot. There's no gap or overlay, so it just looks really, really nice. So I always pin, I nest my seams, and then I always pin on either side of the seam to make sure that as I'm sewing across that seam, for those seams, the fabric doesn't slip, because if it slips, then you don't get that nice spot where all 4 come together. So take this back over to the sewing machine. Get myself organised here, and always use the needle down position. It just means that if I have to stop part way through, my needle stays in the fabric, and again there's less chance of the fabrics slipping apart from each other. Going a little bit slower as we go over the seam. And then finish that off. Again, we're going to snip our threads. Put that there, ready for the next one. Snip our threads off the other side. And we're going to set that seam. And now this time, because you've got dark on each side, it doesn't really matter which side you press to. So usually I press up towards the top row. And depending on your quilt pattern, will depend on whether you press them all the same way or you press them in opposite directions when you sew your next row together. Okay, so we've pressed that, and now we've got our basic 4 patch. Okay, so this is our starting point then for the disappearing 4 patch. Now, it's really handy for doing this sort of a block to have a rotating cutting mat. I've got one. Unfortunately, it's in storage at the moment, so I can't use it today. So I'm going to have to actually turn my mat as we go. But if you've got a rotating cutting mat, that's the easiest way to do it. And what we're going to do, okay, with this 4 patch, is we're going to cut 1 inch on either side of the seam. So that centre seam, we're going to line up on that. We're going to sew 1 inch on either side, and then we're going to turn and we're going to sew 1 inch on either side of the vertical seam as well, sorry, the horizontal seam. So we're making 4 cuts. Okay, we're using our rotary cutter and our ruler. And lining up our 1 inch mark or 1 inch line on the ruler with the seam line, and then we're carefully going to cut along there without shifting our seam, our ruler. Okay, and then I'm going to turn this around. You can do it without a rotating cutting mat, but it's easier when you've got a rotating cutting mat. We're going to do the same thing. We're going to have our 1-inch line on the ruler, lying on our seam line, and we're going to cut across. And then we're going to try carefully not to move those. I'm going to turn that around again, and now I'm going in the opposite direction. Okay, so I'm going to lie that 1-inch line on my cross seam, and here we want to be really careful not to go too fast and push them out of alignment. And we're going to see how it flicks up a little bit in the middle. Be careful of that too. That's where the seam sits. And do the same on the other side. Last time. Make sure that's all pulled apart. Okay, then you can see we've now got 4 corner squares, the centre strips, and we've got a mini 4-patch in the middle. Okay, so what we're going to do, we want to swap these. So we want to swap these ones over in the corners so that they're on opposite corners, and what we're doing there is we're moving that so that we're going against the opposite colour. So now we've got white against the purpley pink, and pink, lilac against the white, okay? And we're also, to keep going with that feeling, we're going to turn our centre 4-patch, mini 4-patch, 1 turn to the right, 1 square to the right. So again, when these rows join up, we've got the white against the lilac and the white against the lilac. Okay, so that's the whole purpose. Then we're going to actually sew those together in rows so that we end up with 3 rows. And we're going to do chain piecing again. So I'm going to take this away to the sewing machine and do that, and then I'll be back to show you the next step in a minute. So once we've sewn our pieces together to make 3 rows, then we need to sew the rows together. And we're going to do that same way as we did our 4-patch, but just a couple of different times. So we're going to take our top row and fold it down right sides together over the middle row. Okay. Now what you're going to find when you do this is that some of the seams will nest and some won't. Okay, and so for this one, I've got the seams in the middle and nesting, and I'm going to start pinning with those and then work my way out. So I want those to nest together nicely in the centre. So I'm going to pin those ones first, making sure they're nicely nested. Then on either side of that, I've got 1 pair of seams that's nesting and 1 pair of seams that's not. They're both going in the same direction. So I'm going to work with the nested seams first and pin those in place. and then I'm going to pin the other two, and I'm going to make sure that they're sitting right on top of each other, and that's just going to need one pin, but we're going to need to be careful as we come close and sew over that because it's extra thickness. So you don't want to go too fast when you're going over that because things will slip and you'll end up with a bit of a mess. Okay, so then once we've pinned those bits, then we keep working our way out from the centre to the outside with just a couple of extra pins, one in the middle and one at the top on that bit, and then the same here, making sure our edges are aligned, one in the middle and one at the bottom. And then we'll take that away to the sewing machine and sew that. Okay. So we'll just quickly sew this in. Now, as I'm coming close to the seams, because I've got quite a few seams together, so I'm going nice and slow. And I want my sewing needle from my sewing machine to be in the side of the seam that I'm securing before I remove the pin. That just helps to keep it in place once the pin's taken out. I'm coming up to that double thickness seam, so I'm going a little bit slower across that. Okay, and then once we're over that, we can go back to normal speed. Again, all of this just helps to keep your points nicely aligned so that it looks nice and pretty. Okay, take our trusty thread snips. Snip that off. Now, at this point, you've got dark and light on both sides, so you're not going to press to the dark side this time because there is no way of telling which side is really the dark side. In this instance, what I like to do is actually press away from the centre towards the outside of the block. So I want the centre piece underneath and the top row on top of it. I'm going to press to set that seam, and then I'm going to press away from the centre. Now, you may find, in fact you will find, if you're sewing a lot of these disc period 4 patches and you want to put them into a quilt, then each block you might want to do the seams differently. So on this block, we'll iron all the seams towards the top. So instead of ironing both out towards the edges, we'll iron both of them towards the top. And then in the next block, we'll iron both or press both the seams towards the bottom. That way, when we're putting them face to face, right sides together, and we're joining those blocks together, we've got nested seams where we're joining the blocks, and that's going to make sure that our strip bits are joining and aligning nicely. Okay, so now we need to sew the bottom row onto the top row. So I'm going to go up this way this time because it's easier to keep the smaller bit on top. Again, I've got this time I've got one nested seam and 2 double thickness seams. So I'm going to start with the nested seam, make sure that's in place. And then I'm going to line up my other 2 seams and pin them in place. Minimise any shifting. Okay, couple of pins along the rest, and then we'll sew this one together. And press it, and then we'll have our disappearing four patch. Okay, let's sew those. Threads out of the way, my tails. Go that little bit slower as we come into our seam area. Right, and so bearing in mind what I just said about pressing the seams all in the same direction, I'm going to actually turn it back over so the wider join strip is on top. I'm going to press that seam to set it, and then I'm going to press that open. So both seams are pointing towards the top of the block. And there we have our disappearing four patch. Now, what we're going to do now is we're going to actually trim it down. But I'll just show you, you can see all the points are lined beautifully because we've pinned everything and we took our time a little bit as we were going over that section. Now we're going to trim it down. We're going to trim it to 8 inches square, and we're going to do that by taking our square ruler, and we're going to line up our 4-inch line on the center seam, the horizontal seam, sorry, the vertical seam, and our horizontal 4-inch ruler line along the horizontal seam. If you've got diagonal seam markings on your ruler, line those up as well, your 45-degree line. Make sure everything's lined up. Make sure that what you're cutting off is outside the 8 inches. So 8 inches is here and here. So if I cut, I'm not going to actually cut within that 8 inches, because then I'll have to cut it even smaller. So I'm just going to hold that nice and firmly. Right, and we're going to take those off. And then we're going to spin that 180 degrees and do the same. Line up our 4-inch lines on the center, on the vertical and horizontal seams. But now our 8-inch lines should line up with the edges of the block that we just trimmed. Making sure it's nice and straight, our diagonals are in place. I'm going to trim that down. Bother. And always, always check that it's been cut through before you move your ruler, and that's a very good example of why you do that. Okay, pop this away, and now we have our disappearing four patch. Okay, so these together then, when you sew them together, will start to make an alternating pattern. There you go. I hope that you've enjoyed that tutorial. That workshop. We've certainly enjoyed doing it for you. If you're a beginner quilter or you'd like a refresher, we've actually got a Facebook group that's called the Block of the Month group, Layered Creations Block of the Month group. You can join that by going to our Facebook page and look for that. And in there, I do a block. Initially it was every month. It's not always every month now because I've had to go back to full-time work, but I do blocks and demonstrate how to make them. I started with the foundation blocks like your 4-patch, your 9-patch, your half square triangles, your quarter square triangles, and worked our way through those. And I will keep adding to that as often as I can to make a nice little library for you and give you lots of hints and tips around the best ways to actually make these different blocks. So if you'd like to join that, jump over onto our Facebook page and have a look at that. If you'd like to see some of the fabrics we've used, so the white pattern fabric out of here is out of our Bambini Brights collection, and the lilac colour is out of our Colour Blends collection. They are available in our shop, which is on our website, www.layeredcreations.com.au. If you've got any questions, feel free to pop them through now in the chat, or you can email me later. There's a form on the website that you can contact me through. You can email me on layercreate@bigpond.com, or you can phone me on 043 997 2514. Please remember, if you're in the eastern states, that I'm on WA time, so we're 3 hours behind you at the moment. So I hope you've enjoyed that, and I look forward to seeing you at another show somewhere or on our Facebook page. Bye.